Engineering is the magic that makes our world and shapes our lives. Extraordinary breakthroughs have changed the course of history and taken us further than our ancestors could have ever imagined. But with every new frontier comes unknown risks when we face the horrifying consequences of our overreaching. From the Hindenburg airship explosion to the Challenger space shuttle disaster, we revisit these devastating experiences and uncover how these tragedies occurred. Why did the Titanic really sink? How were hundreds of thousands of people poisoned in Bhopal, India? What can we learn from these mistakes that will make mankind take the next giant leap forward? Engineers take us to places we have never been before. But as we explore the outer reaches of our world, the risks become greater. In this episode, we witness how one exploration to depths of 30,000 feet and another 46,000 feet in the air ended in tragedy.
Obviously a major malfunction.
Why did the Space Shuttle Challenger explode seconds after takeoff?
My heart about sank at that point in time. Oh my God, this may have failed for exactly the reason we tried to stop the launch.
What were the consequences of the Deepwater Horizon disaster?
Imagine what it would be like to pour 1 barrel of oil into the Gulf of Mexico and then doing that almost 5 million times.
Both occurred when those involved felt their safest and had forgotten the dangers of exploration.
This really was, up to that point, seen as a flagship program and a successful program.
There were mistakes made at all stages of this operation.
Both played out in front of millions across the world.
It was a travesty, an absolute travesty.
And both show how the groupthink of many risked the lives of a few.
Unfortunately, the politics overtook the science.
The warnings were there, but tragically, they were ignored.
Deepwater Horizon.
An ecological disaster in the making. The offshore rig exploded and sank into the Gulf of Mexico 2 weeks ago.
We are actively continuing a search and rescue effort and holding out hope that we may find one of these 11 missing people.
Oil has been the basis of Western civilization since the industrial age. Like it or not, it pretty much powers the way we live.
The annual value of oil and gas produced worldwide is about $2 trillion.
In 2010, oil was worth almost double what it is today. This black gold rush led companies to push exploration faster, deeper, and with focus on more dangerous offshore rigs.
Oil companies are drilling a mile underwater before they hit ground, and then a mile below that before they hit oil.
If big oil gets its way, every inch of the outer continental shelf is going to be drilled.
Technologically, it's the equivalent in complexity of sending a rocket to the moon and landing on it. And it's also every bit as dangerous as spaceflight, if not more so. This is an inherently risky procedure to go to the bottom of the ocean and dig into highly pressurized, highly volatile oil deposits.
The oil and gas industry is one of the most dangerous occupational sectors in the world. It is not a question of if disaster happens, but when. There have been many tragedies over the decades.
The scale of the tragedy has caused even the most experienced workers to consider their own future on the rigs.
Oil is causing a long slick on the surface of the water.
It's an effort to contain the oil and assess the damage.
The fire on board burst into renewed intensity,
pumping thousands of gallons of seawater at the blaze.
And do you think there are other platforms, other rigs out there, which are posing a similar danger?
Oh yes, there isn't that much dissimilarity to many of the platforms.
An explosion of gas aboard the Piper Alpha platform caused a huge flare-up.
Those deaths, according to the official report on the disaster, might have been avoided if there'd been proper protection.
And as platforms continue to get older, experts warn it will only get more difficult to keep them operating safely.
The oil and gas industry is now taking more and more risks, and the key for all those involved is to manage those risks very, very carefully. Because no matter how much money you throw at it or how important you say safety is, there is still a chance of disaster occurring.
Deepwater Horizon was positioned approximately 66 kilometers off the coast of Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico, drilling at a depth of 5,000 meters.
It's estimated to contain 50 million barrels of oil, and BP had purchased the rights to drill there. Deepwater Horizon was owned by Transocean and leased by BP.
The Macondo well, which is the well that they were exploring, was very difficult geologically because this huge sort of lake of oil below the surface of the ocean bottom was under extreme high pressure, and the sandstone walls that it was contained in were rather fragile.
When drilling, the greater the pressure, the greater the chance of a blowout.
A blowout is when you have an uncontrolled release of oil and gas from some region of a well that you're either drilling or has been completed. And for some reason, the containment mechanisms that you've got in place have failed, and you get a blowout of high pressure oil and gas coming onto the deck of the drilling rig.
And once that's ignited, then that would account for a series of explosions culminating in this massive destruction.
The blowout preventer sits at the top of the well, sitting on the seabed, and is the means by which you connect the well with the riser that goes up to the drilling rig.
When you're on a rig offshore in the deep water, the blowout preventer is fundamental to everything that's happening and to your safety, and everyone knows that.
The law says that if anything of significance goes wrong with the BOP, that they are required to pull it back up on the rig and fix it before they continue their drilling. I mean, that's an incredibly complex procedure, and it can take weeks or even months. It costs $1 million a day to have that rig out there and operating. So every hour lost is like $42,000. So there was so much pressure not to do that.
Ironically, on the day of the accident, 2 BP executives flew out to the platform to present Transocean with a safety award for having lasted 7 years with no working days lost to accidents.
I think there's always a risk of complacency. I mean, we see it ourselves. You know, if you drive a car, for example, a car is quite a potentially very dangerous piece of equipment. But because we're so familiar with it, there's a risk of becoming complacent and forgetting that.
The whole purpose of the Deepwater Horizon was to get a complete and detailed understanding of the nature of the oil deposit and of the conditions surrounding it, and then to cap it, to seal it, so that BP could decide to put a production rig out there and start pumping the oil.
So at the time, they were 43 days behind schedule and about $43 million over budget. So there was a lot of pressure to do things as quickly as possible.
When you're closing down an exploratory rig, there are certain abandonment procedures that need to be followed to ensure a safe departure. Deepwater Horizon was in these final stages and performed a routine negative pressure test, which would determine if the newly created cement seal was secure, ensuring that no oil or gas would escape from the well into the ocean. However, the test showed abnormal results, and so an additional test on a secondary line was issued.
The kill line is an alternative line that bypasses the blowout preventer and then hooks back into the well shaft. There were some people who were uneasy about this because really that's not the way you're supposed to do the test. And yet BP declared it a good, clear negative test.
Quite clearly, it was in their interest that the result of the negative pressure tests was positive so that they could move on. And so when they got these anomalous results and there was a difference between them, they chose to believe the one that was favorable.
The interpretation of the negative test happened amidst this incredible pressure from BP to hurry up and get this rig out of there.
Unbeknownst to the crew, there was a great deal of activity happening underneath the surface, and there was a vicious combination of drilling mud, gas and seawater bubbling its way up to the surface.
As oil and gas started rushing up the well, it took 40 minutes for the crew to notice. By the time they did, the flammable mixture wasn't diverted over the side, but through a separate system which carried it onto the rig.
And as it came up, it expanded and accelerated, and then it burst through, and the first thing that happened was all the drilling mud that was in the riser got blown out through the top, and it rained all over the deck.
For many of the crew, this was the first indication of a disaster in the making.
This meant the oil and gas clouded potential ignition sources on the rig. As a result, fire prevention systems were overwhelmed, and flammable gas was sucked into the engine rooms, where it ignited.
The force of the explosion almost destroyed the accommodation block that's sitting on the rig where everybody lived. So it was instantly like a war zone. There were stairs that were collapsed, walls that were down, and at the same time, this unstoppable fire being fed by this gigantic blowtorch of petroleum that's coming up from the bottom of the ocean.
When it exploded, the whole rig drifted away, which means that the pipe tugged on the blowout preventer.
This caused the riser, which is the flexible pipe from the blowout preventer up to the drilling rig, to buckle and then fracture,
rendering the BOP ineffective.
The explosion cut control lines to the device at the surface, meaning the surviving crew couldn't seal it. Then an automatic shut-off failed, possibly due to flat batteries or a faulty part on the device.
Meaning that an uncontrollable rush of gas and oil continued to cover the rig. Flames devoured the rig, and oil was released straight into the ocean as the crew attempted to escape. But for some, it was too late. 11 men didn't make it off.
The Deepwater Horizon accident resulted in the biggest marine oil spill we've ever seen. There were mistakes made at all stages of this operation. Some were made by Transocean in not being able to deploy the mechanisms for stopping it that were there. And then there was BP, who, as the operator, has absolute responsibility for everything that happens on the rig, including safety.
I hear comments sometimes that large oil companies are greedy companies or don't care, but that is not the case in BP. We care about the small people.
The energy giant is battling to repair the ruptured well and to contain oil spill. Efforts, they say, are costing more than $6 million a day.
BP basically was trying to blame the disaster on everybody else. It was trying to blame Transocean for the fact that the blowout preventer hadn't been properly maintained, and it was trying to blame the crew on the rig for misinterpreting the faulty negative test, when in fact BP had its hand in all of these things.
Let me be clear. BP is responsible for this leak. BP will be paying the bill.
BP faces a growing regiment of critics, and today yet another committee of inquiry from an administration that refuses to take on trust anything the company says about the cleanup operation or the cause of the calamity.
The oil giant's been plunged into the red by the $32.2 billion it set aside to pay for the devastating Gulf of Mexico oil disaster.
A small loss for oil giant BP, who in 2011, the following year, declared net profits of over $25 billion.
The other oil majors are going to see this and say, great, this is a small fine, this is a rounding error.
Public anger is mounting. Activists like Seas BP are taking to the streets in protest in Washington.
This is what it looks like in the marshes. This is what it looks like for the fishermen down there. And I think you need to be charged with a crime.
So if we look ahead 6 months, a year, what do you think the environmental impact of this disaster will be?
I think the environmental impact of this disaster is likely to have been very, very modest.
The biggest environmental disaster in US history. 11 people lost their lives, and the cost stands at $41 billion and counting.
But the surrounding environment and the people of Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi paid a heavier price.
To imagine the extent of this oil spill, imagine what it would be like to pour 1 barrel of oil into the Gulf of Mexico and then doing that almost 5 million times.
The fishermen here are used to living with oil. They are not used to oil taking that living away.
Add the recession and the temporary ban on offshore oil drilling and the local economies in tatters.
It's really frustrating when it's not a God-sent disaster. You know, with hurricanes, you really can't get mad. You deal with them, they end, you clean up and you get going. But with this is like a never-ending hurricane.
An entire fishing industry worth $2.4 billion to Louisiana alone is closed down.
We cannot even begin to start our recovery because we don't know the extent of the damage.
The initial impact was really severe.
The last 8 days we've watched 250 birds, and so we're averaging between 30 and 40 birds a day.
We plan for the worst, but we can't fight all of Mother Nature, and we can't fight an accident like this to the degree we would like to.
Hundreds of dead whales and dolphins were found, and the estimates are more than 1 million birds.
In oil spills, dispersants are used to clean up.
Dispersants are surfactants, basically soap molecules, that are used to disperse oil into water to make it easier to clean away.
And typically they're sprayed onto the oil on the sea surface in an oil spill.
But that specific event was so severe, a lot of dispersants were actually injected at different depths. And what wasn't expected was that they emulsified into really tiny droplets that were suspended throughout the water column all the way to the seafloor.
Dr. George Crozier worries about the long-term effect on sea life, not of the sticky crude, but of elements in its makeup. They're believed to cause cancer.
In the aftermath, there were a few hundred people that reported having suffered from various levels of medical issues related to the oil spill.
We have a reputation to have the best seafood in the world. If one person gets sick on the seafood, it ruins our whole image, and it ruins our whole lives.
Once you have toxins in your body that don't kill you immediately, they can lead to cancers, liver problems, heart problems.
It will almost certainly be attributable to Deepwater Horizon.
BP says the oil spill's over. I don't think this is over. It just breaks your heart.
Out of every accident comes good practice for the future.
BP says it's working to ensure that the lessons learned from the Deepwater Horizon disaster do lead to improvements in deepwater drilling operations.
BP committed to give $500 million to research into the Gulf of Mexico. So much research has been enabled by that money that would have otherwise not happened.
In the case of blowout preventers, both the design but particularly the checking procedures have improved dramatically.
With the increased risks, the increased costs, we're not going to be able to sustain this kind of fossil fuel use. This planet can't sustain it.
There is no planet B.
I think there are lessons to learn, not just on the oil spill technical problem, but on how we deal with environmental disasters.
For those who expected BP to refocus the company away from oil towards gas and renewables, the message today was very clear. BP's future lies in oil, and more specifically, in deep sea oil.